Bonjour et bienvenue au prochain épisode spécial des élections européennes. Cette fois, nous allons regarder la France et les événements merveilleux des dernières semaines. Hello and welcome to the Commoners podcast for yet another election special. Two fairly close back to back. This time we'll be looking at the presidential elections in France, and especially the events over the past few months leading up to the vote, which will be on the 23rd of April, so just a few days away. John, how are you doing?
I'm doing okay. This week has been a little stressful. I had to make a pretty substantial presentation in front of the partners and the owners of my company, and it's a project that I was working on for like a year, and it was obviously asking for money, essentially, and it's never easy to get in front of the owners or partners of a company, telling them that they need to spend more money. Never really goes over well, so hard presentation to make, but it was well received.
Good.
But I haven't quite fully mentally recovered from the stress.
And then on top of that, of course, you were tasked with diving into yet another European country, its political system, its election history, and particularly the recent history of European politics as we're kind of gearing up for this election special. So do you feel confident about France and its election and political history?
I do. Somehow I was able to shoe in enough research to feel confident about what I'm going to say. So I think...
Good. And you, of course, are the biggest fan of France, are you not?
Yeah, well, we don't need to get into that right now, but France is okay. I'd visit, maybe.
All right, okay. I had the good fortune of living in the south of France when I was a kid. It was the first place that I lived in outside of Scotland, so I was really looking forward to getting into this, because I'd never, obviously being a kid, you don't really care too much about the political setup of the country that you're living in, so it was nice to kind of take an in-depth look. France, of course, is one of the two major European Union powers. The European Union is very much a Franco-German EU, and France wields a significant amount of clout, both politically and economically.
Right, and we did get into that a little bit last episode in our Brexit special, where France and Germany are going to kind of be the big players in mainland Europe with the Brexit negotiations that are about to go on.
Yeah, that's right. And so whoever takes the reins after this election will have a lot of influence on how the Brexit negotiations are going to go forward. Of course, that's not the only thing. France is also a member of NATO. It's one of the few nuclear powers in the world and has a permanent seat in the UN Security Council. France is a former colonial power who's actually beginning to experience a little bit of a reverse colonization. Many people from the French colonial world have moved back into mainland France and have begun bringing their own belief systems, their own cultures, and in the eyes of some, diluting French culture and values. Because of this, France is at the centre of yet another rise of the right wing, and is probably the most important one in Europe. The right wing in France has experienced about 15 years of growth, particularly through the Front National. And unlike the US and the UK, it's actually the younger people, it's our age, John, the under 30s, who actually are tending to be the more nationalistic.
I'm sure we'll get to this later, but actually, speaking of this 15-year growth in support for the National Front, in 2002, actually similar to when the right wing started to rise in the Netherlands with Pim Fortuyn, we talked about in the Netherlands election special, the National Front with Jean-Marie Le Pen actually made it into the second round runoff for president of France, like completely unexpectedly. And he is the father, by the way, of Marine Le Pen, who is now running for president. And essentially, the centrist right wing of the country, really the Republican Front, it was called, sort of just rallied together to make sure that in the second runoff he would not become president. But I mean, that sort of signaled the fact that the National Front was going to be a big player in politics in France moving forward.
Well, and also, kind of in the same way that we saw in the Netherlands, it was the current rise of the right wing is not a current blip. It has been going on for a long time. So, like you said, Pim Fortuyn was a major force in Dutch politics, even though he was assassinated before he was elected to any major office. But Geert Wilders and the PVV managed to support a Dutch government at one point. The Front National, like you said, have made it into the second round of the presidential race before. So these issues aren't recent. They're not in the same line as Trump necessarily, or in the same line as Brexit. They're much older.
They've been simmering under the surface for a while.
For a long, long time, much longer than I think we realize.
Which is funny because, at least as an American, when I look at France, I think Europe, I think Paris. I don't necessarily think that France has a culture or a right-wing culture, but it certainly does.
Yeah, no, it certainly does. And in response to a threat to that kind of romantic French ideal of French sovereignty and supremacy. So particularly, you've got immigrants coming in from North Africa who are Muslim, who are North African, of course, and they bring their culture, and their kids grew up in France, and suddenly you have this diluting of the French culture, which, if you talk to many French people, French culture is one of the main values. Like, if you go and you read the history of the French Revolution, you had the beginning of this supreme idea of the French people and the French nation as this supreme value. And that still exists today, and of course it's now under threat, or perceivably so. France, like many other places in Europe, has seen a turning away from the two-party model where the centre-left and the centre-right kind of challenge back and forth between each other, so much so that the socialists, the ruling centre-left party, are in such a dire state that they look as if they're only going to get about 9% of the vote. The opposition centre-right, essentially the main Conservative Party, is also faring very poorly in the polls, and instead you've got the rise of anti-establishment candidates, either independents or just extremists. The French presidency is a powerful executive, and if everything aligns as it should over the next few months, the president will have significant power to chart France's course over the next 5 years, which will include Brexit, it'll include Syria, and it'll include the growing Russian threat in the East. So, because of France's relative power and influence in the world stage and the power of the presidential office, the person elected to that office will have significant effect on the direction of European, if not world, history. So that is essentially why we're going to be spending so much time looking at the French election, and why it gets its own special podcast as well.
It really is fascinating. I had to do a lot of research going into this because I wasn't really familiar with the French political system. And can I do a little rant here on comparative politics for a second?
Yeah, on you go.
So France has 67 million people. Its population is about 67 million. Their constitution, their current constitution, which established the Fifth Republic, they've had many constitutions in the past, but their most recent one was ratified in 1958. So it's been around for 59 years, give or take. That constitution's been amended 24 times, which is like almost once every 2 to 3 years. The United States, just as a comparison, ratified its constitution in 1789. And it's been amended 27 times, which is on average about once every 8 years. And even then, there are, if you look throughout United States history, there are periods of, brief periods where there's a lot of amendments done to the Constitution, and then there's long periods where there's no change whatsoever.
And also, one of your amendments nullifies one of the other amendments.
Yeah, exactly. So when you're looking at France's system, or at least their modernized Constitution, on the surface, it definitely looks a lot more responsive to the needs and wants of the people and the government as it changes, where you just don't really see that in the United States. You see a lot of Supreme Court precedent and things like that determine what the Constitution is saying, but you don't have as robust or detailed as the Constitution like you have in France, because it was written in the modern era, So it's much more in tune with the needs of the country and the culture.
In fact, it was specifically rewritten because of the failures of the Constitution before it. The Constitution before it essentially led to a lot of political instability, so it was recognized that this was the case, and so they essentially said, nope, we will redo this. And so they sat down and rewrote the Constitution and ratified it, as you said, in 1958.
Yeah, and this constitution, it expanded the presidential powers, which is important because we're focusing on the presidential office that's up for election in France. And also what I found really interesting is that the constitution can be amended. What essentially happens is the two houses of their parliament, they have the lower house, which is the National Assembly, and the upper house, which is the Senate. The National Assembly and the Senate can propose amendments to the Constitution, and there's two ways that those can be ratified. They can either be ratified by the entire Congress in essentially a joint house, or they can actually be ratified by direct referendum for the people. So you put this amendment up to a direct vote.
There's a novel idea, eh?
It's amazing. That doesn't happen in the United States. So the United States Constitution is very difficult to amend. So that their Constitution is very responsive to the needs of the people. I mentioned the National Assembly and the Senate. The National Assembly is directly elected. The deputies to the National Assembly are directly elected. There's 577 members. So if you do the math, there's 67 million people in France. There's 577 members of the National Assembly, and these are the direct representatives of those people. They're elected in essentially a first past the post system. In the first round, if you get 12.5% of the vote, then you're eligible to go on to the second round, and then whoever wins the second round of voting, essentially whoever gets more than 50% of the vote in the second round becomes the one representative or deputy from that constituency. But there's 577 of them, which means there's one representative per 116,000 people, give or take, roughly. In the United States, we have 325 million people, and the House of Representatives only has 435 members, and that means there's one rep per 745,000 people, roughly. And not only that, the reps get to basically draw their own voting districts once they're in power through gerrymandering. The only state that doesn't allow it is California. So if you look at those systems, not only is the Constitution more pliable, I would say, I guess, or maybe responsive to the people, there's definitely a more proportional. I would think that you would see a higher level of representation in France because you have more members in the National Assembly for fewer people.
Yeah.
And I think you see that in Britain as well. The UK has 60 million people, give or take.
Yep. And
how many members of parliament are there?
630, I believe.
Right, so you're looking at about one per, it's even less than 100,000.
Yeah, about 1 in 112,000, something like that.
Which is more like a mayor of a large city rather than a governor.
Yeah.
So,
well, and also add into that both of these European systems, the UK and France, have multi-party systems. So you have even more of a plethora of views represented as well, and not just two, main parties represented. So France certainly seems to have more of a representative system, more of a, I don't want to call it reactionary because that evokes too many negative things, particularly given their history of revolution, but they can react appropriately to the modern times and the crises that, affect the modern nation.
Their Senate, similar to the United States, the senators are not directly elected. They're elected through an electoral college. That was originally how the United States Constitution was written, but it was amended later to allow for the direct election of senators. There's 348 of those. So that's one per every about 192,000. Whereas in the United States, there's only 100, which means literally there's one senator per 3.24 million people, which is pretty crazy. And I know that on a conceptual basis, the senators are supposed to represent the states, but they do, in the United States, they do look towards their constituency, and they are worried about getting reelected. So, not very representative.
Sure.
I just want to go on a rant there, because every time I do this sort of comparative politics situation, even countries that I'm not a big fan of, like France, they have better government systems.
Yes. To perhaps put your mind at ease a little bit regarding the French situation, particularly the Senate. The Senate isn't a particularly powerful house. The lower house can always override the Senate, a lot like the UK actually. But
the lower house is the direct representation of the people.
That's correct.
Which is how it should work, in my opinion.
Yes. But the problem is that the Senate still needs to ratify most things that come from the National Assembly, and the Senate is actually elected by regional councillors, department councillors, essentially elected officials all the way up the ladder. But the problem with that is that it tends to be more representative of rural constituencies. So the Senate is often always on the right. Very few times in history has the Senate ever had a left-wing coalition. And so it's as much of the frustration of the socialists and the further left that the Senate is always kind of right biased. So that there are built-in biases even within the French system. It's not 100% favourable to complete neutrality.
Well, that's comforting. So along with their parliament, which is, as we've discussed, made up of the National Assembly and the Senate, there is a semi-presidential system.
That's right.
Which is sort of a hybrid almost between something like the UK and the United States. Instead
of the executive power being wholly vested in the government and then checked by Parliament, as it is in the UK, and instead of the power being vested in two different types of authority, i.e. the executive and legislative, like it is so clearly done in the American system, in which you have the president as executive and then the legislative branch being Congress, instead you've kind of got a mix of the two, in which you have a strong presidential figure and a strong executive branch with distinct powers unto himself, and an executive branch within the legislative branch that also has power. So it's almost a shared executive between a strong executive branch and a legislative branch. So there is a government, just like any other parliamentary system, that is accountable to the legislative branch. But at the same time, you've got this strong presidential executive that's there, with, again, specific powers that we'll kind of define later. Yeah, the semi-presidential system is defined by the Constitution of the Fifth Republic. It was an answer to the weakness of the Fourth Republic, which was a parliamentary republic designed for ministerial stability. Unfortunately, it provided absolutely zero ministerial stability. The system just didn't work. Essentially, because of the multi-party nature of the parliament, they couldn't decide on who was meant to be in the cabinet, and so there was never really a strong government formed. So the Fifth Republic came along under the influence of Charles de Gaulle, and he instituted essentially a strong presidential executive.
Yes, he did.
Especially relative to the parliamentary system beforehand, but not too much unlike other presidential systems like the United States, for instance.
Yeah, actually, interesting story. Charles de Gaulle was a big fan of having a strong presidency. And essentially what he did in 1962 was, this was shortly after the Constitution was ratified, he really actually pushed through a constitutional amendment referendum to the people to essentially put it to an up or down vote whether or not the president should be elected by an electoral college or by direct vote of the people, which it is now. And there was a huge controversy about it because at the time, the reading of the Constitution, still is the reading of the Constitution, is that these amendments need to be proposed by either the National Assembly or the Senate, and then ratified by them in a joint Congress or put to a referendum. So the president shouldn't be saying, well, let's amend the Constitution and let's put this to a referendum. And he did that, and it passed. And so they changed the Constitution, perhaps unconstitutionally, because he just to sort of highlight the sort of power that was allowed the president, and he would have definitely been a fan of that.
Especially Charles de Gaulle as well. I mean, he was a military leader. He was a very popular leader. And he was ultimately a pragmatist as well. So he was going to be able to, with his popular clout, be able to kind of push through what he wanted. A little bit questionable, but the system today doesn't suffer because of it. So I guess it was ultimately, especially for us, any good Democrat would be in favour of a directly elected executive. But again, the it is a semi-presidential system, and so it's not just the president. It is also shared with the Prime Minister, who is the head of government. And arguably the most important power that the president has is actually to name the Prime Minister. So after the National Assembly is indeed assembled, it's the president that gets to name the Prime Minister. So even though it's a shared power between executives, the president on one hand, the Prime Minister on the other, it's the president who gets to choose his Prime Minister. Now, he can name the Prime Minister, but he can't dismiss him. And the president also gets to name and dismiss the other members of the cabinet, but only with the agreement of the Prime Minister. There are also a few major powers that the president has. For instance, he's the one that promulgates the laws. He is the last kind of authoritative signatory to any law that comes out. It kind of has a limited veto though, so essentially all he can do is ask the Assembly to reconsider legislation, or he can refer it over to the Constitutional Council, essentially the equivalent of the Supreme Court. Now, it can also dissolve the Assembly, essentially whenever he wants, sparking an immediate legislative election. He's the Commander-in-Chief of the military and has the sole authoritative use of the country's nuclear arsenal. It can grant pardons, and this is perhaps another important one. In practice, the president has significant power and influence over national security and foreign diplomacy. So everything done outside of the French borders, that is essentially, practically the remit of solely of the President of France.
We'll get to this later, I'm sure, but correct me if I'm wrong, the Prime Minister does have to be from the largest party inside of the National Assembly, correct?
Technically, he doesn't have to be from the largest party, but he does have to command a majority of the House. So like any other parliamentary system, the government can only stand if it has the support of 50% plus one of the members of the House. So the easiest way to do this is to get the largest party and then a few smaller parties that agree with the larger party to kind of coalesce around a coalition. But technically, the president could appoint whoever he wants. Even if they don't have a coalition. Correct, but then you're still talking about problems of legislation, particularly for domestic issues in which they still need to be passed by the parliament. So,
which is important, I think, and we'll get to this later, because say Marine Le Pen were to win the presidency.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem likely at this point, but say that she would still have a lot of difficulty forming a government and getting the things that she wants to get done.
Correct. So if she were indeed to become president, she would have significant power. Like that list of things that I had mentioned, those would be her powers to wield. The problem is that anything that she would want to do, particularly on a domestic level, she would have to do through the National Assembly. And that would mean that she would have to appoint a prime minister. And who does she appoint? Does she appoint a Republican, kind of a centre-right conservative, or does she appoint someone on the far right from a really small party that, won't get the confidence of the House? Like, functionally, that just wouldn't work. So there is this weird thing, and it has happened a few times in the past, called cohabitation. Essentially, if a president can't appoint a member of his own party as prime minister, he has to appoint someone anyway that can control the majority of the House. And it sometimes has to be your opponent, which is a rather odd circumstance that I think only exists within the French system.
Well, I mean, yeah, in the United States, the president doesn't appoint the Speaker of the House or the Senate Majority Leader, obviously. But they can definitely be of an opposite party, and it can be very difficult for the president to get things done.
But that's more out of a nature of checks and balances, whereas what happens in cohabitation is literally a splitting of the executive, in which you've got two branches, essentially, of the executive functioning on different political ideologies. And because the president seems to have, again, practically significant influence in external affairs, it's the prime minister and his government that is charged with the day-to-day running of really domestic affairs within France. And so you have this odd case in which if the president can appoint his own prime minister, you have a very, very strong centralized presidential executive authority, where the president has almost full influence and complete authority over the day-to-day running of the state. However, if it results in cohabitation, you have this weird instance in which you have an executive branch running the foreign affairs, but a parliamentary system running the domestic affairs, completely separate from each other. So it's an odd circumstance. Again, it has only happened 3 times in the longest period over 5 years, but there you go. It happens. It's shared power. It's just a different way of doing it.
So what kind of power would the president say then if it were cohabitation? What sort of power would the president have in wanting to leave the EU if that were the case?
Now, as we know from our discussion in our Brexit special just a couple of weeks ago, we know that the Article 50 requires that the country itself kind of define the constitutional means by which it removes itself from the EU. I would assume that France, being a particularly referenda-happy country, that it would probably follow the British lead and also hold a referendum. And I believe that it needs to be an agreement between both executive branches, between the president and the government inside the National Assembly, to hold. You would need agreement of both essentially to hold a referendum. So even if Marine Le Pen won the presidency, she might face kind of a backlash from within the National Assembly, from within her own government. The problem is that she might be able to claim kind of a democratic mandate to hold such a referendum, and then you get into all the complex political dealings behind closed doors.
Could she then, if she were to leverage her position and talk about wanting to do an e-referendum, but the National Assembly were blocking her for whatever reason, if I understand this correctly, she could dissolve the government and call for elections, and then essentially the people could maybe put people in power that will support her agenda. That's
correct. She has the sole power to, or would have the sole power to dissolve the legislative assembly. So she could take that risk. The problem is, of course, that if her opponents are elected en masse, then she has zero power whatsoever to do anything. Not only because, she's limited in her executive powers, but also because then she would have no political mandate whatsoever. So, again, it's a fairly decent check and balance. It's just a different way of doing it. It's an internal executive check in a sense. So obviously especially as regards this particular presidential election, a lot of what will happen in the next 5 years, especially because we're talking about outsiders, kind of non-establishment contenders, a lot of what will happen over the next 5 years will be dependent on the legislative elections that are actually coming up in June, and it might merit a fairly decent chunk of a podcast in a month or so, in which we're kind of looking at the legislative side of the stuff, because obviously that is where the government will come from. So June 11th and June 18th, just in a couple months, will be the legislative elections as well.
Definitely. Maybe we could do even, rather than a full episode, maybe we could even do a live stream on it.
Yeah, that's actually not such a bad idea, because there's a lot of kind of cool little details about the French system that I've not found in too many other places. For instance, the party structure within France is actually a fairly weak and fluid and flexible one. So unlike, here in the UK where we've had the Conservatives for 150 odd years and Labour for about 100 years, and they're still the two main parties, France seems to be okay with the idea of parties popping up and folding and re-establishing themselves. For example, the Republicans, the centre-right Conservative Party, used to be the Union for Popular Movement. They completely closed down in 2015 and restarted as Les Républicains. So it's certainly a more fluid situation. As much as the country kind of adapts to circumstances, so do parties.
Yeah, and we'll get into this a little bit later too, but one of the candidates that's running right now is Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who actually has seen a surge in the polls recently, but he is a leftist. He's more or less sort of a socialist. And what happened was the Socialist Party nominated Benoît Hamon. This guy, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, essentially split off, started his own party called Unsubmissive France. And now he's actually polling higher, much higher, almost twice as high as the actual Socialist Party nominee. So you can see how the party shift and change in the United States. You could never have a party start last year and then have somebody in the polling top 3 for the presidential election. It would never happen.
And the very front runner himself, or at least the expected winner of the whole thing, Emmanuel Macron, is exactly the same. In fact, he's only ever been just associated with the socialists, and here he is now the main contender for the presidency, having not actually been part of any major party. So it's certainly a much, much more fluid situation. But like I said, and quite similar to many other countries in the world, it was and is a two-party system. And it's essentially been the socialists against les républicains since the 1980s, and they've kind of competed back and forth for power.
Well, they do have several parties. It's just that it's more divided along ideological lines.
Particularly when you get down to the pragmatic basis of the National Assembly, then yes, you do have a left-wing coalition and a right-wing coalition. But nonetheless, when it comes to the presidency, is again, for the past 30-odd years, been these two parties. And it's kind of similar to the UK system in that sense, in that, yes, the UK is technically a multi-party system, but we haven't had anything other than a Labour or a Conservative Prime Minister since I think the 1920s, almost 100 years. Maybe there was a Liberal one in the early days, but almost 100 years of just these two parties, and obviously it's fairly similar in France. But now we are seeing kind of the breakup of the establishment and real moves towards the anti-establishment parties. And the French system only plays into that type of fluidity. In fact, it encourages the fluidity out to the extremes or into the middle, kind of away from what's already established.
So historically, it's been more representative of the multi-party system in parliament, but not so much in the presidency, but you're thinking that's going to start to change.
I'm thinking that now is the time in which France is going to realize yet another shift. So before the 1980s, there was another kind of two-party dominance for a while, and I think we're kind of on the verge of another one in which France will essentially leave the socialists behind, and really, due to the misfortunes or rather the shenanigans of the centre-right Republican candidate, will be leaving the Republicans behind as well. So France is seeing a move towards the anti-establishment candidates, definitely. And I think that will kind of establish a new way of doing things for French elections in the future.
So the way that France elects its president, which I'm a big fan of. I'm reading about this, researching it. I think this is brilliant. The first round of elections, everybody who's a candidate, who I think you need to have 500 signatures of members of government to essentially be able to put your name on the ballot. Mm-hmm. Everybody who's on the ballot is out there, and if nobody gets 50% of the vote or more than 50% of the vote, which has not happened in the Fifth Republic, it's not happened since the Constitution of 1958. If nobody gets 50% in the first round, then there is a runoff election between the top two, whoever gets the top two largest chunks of the vote.
It's a nice little system, isn't it? Because not only do you get the chance for, the minor candidates to actually make a stand, to actually, put their ideas out there, but then you definitely end up with an executive that has the support of at least 50% of the people.
That's right. And also, if you look at what other candidates get a lot of the votes, you can kind of see where the populace wants to see the nation move as well. You can kind of get take the temperature of the political mood of the country just by kind of watching the vote unfold. Whereas in the United States, you don't even waste your time voting for anybody but a Republican or a Democrat. You can't really measure the true attitude of the country because it's a first past the post system that it's tactical voting in the United States essentially. You're very rarely are you voting for the person you actually want to vote for.
Yeah, absolutely.
So in this upcoming election in France, which the first round happens on Sunday, April 23rd.
That's right.
I love that as well. Actually, something else. Can we talk about comparative politics here for a second too?
Yeah, sure. On you go.
They seem to go out of their way to make sure that it's as democratic as possible, where there is a ban on coverage of polling results until days after the election, or at least on the day of the election. You can't report what the polls are saying because that might influence somebody not to go to vote. They even went so far as the holdings or the dependencies of France in the Americas, like Guadeloupe or French Guiana, they vote on Saturday because the results would start rolling in, poll results would start rolling in earlier for them on a Sunday, and they would maybe be influenced not to go out to vote. So to stop that from happening, they even moved their voting to Saturday so that they have the complete motivation to go out and vote. Which I just thought that's so much more accommodating to voters than it is in the United States. If anything, we see voter suppression attempts in the United States. Like, we want fewer people out.
Yeah, it's a nice little touch, isn't it? Just kind of making sure those little things are actually caught up and thought of and dealt with as well.
Mm-hmm. And the official campaigning period actually started 2 days ago for the election. I think it started April 10th. During that official campaigning period, the media cannot, by law, focus or spend more time on one candidate over the other. Everybody has to have equal time, which I think is awesome. Mm-hmm. In the United States, Trump got millions upon millions of dollars of free advertising because they would just focus on him all the time. Yep. There were instances where, I forget who it was, either it was Cruz or Rubio were having a speech, and literally CNN, I think it was, where they had their cameras on Trump's empty podium for like an hour instead of covering the other candidate's speech. Not to say that I like Cruz or Rubio, but it's just, you wonder why Trump had the popularity that he did. It's because he was covered more than any other candidate. You wouldn't get that in France because you're required by law to equally cover each person. I just thought that was a brilliant touch.
Yep. Yeah. It's something that I've been convinced of, having lived here as well, actually, the necessary curbs on the media surrounding elections. So the same type of rules actually apply here in the UK within that 30-day election period, in which essentially the media is monitored for bias, more or less. Newspapers are exempt. They're just ridiculous, but anything that is on television is monitored. And then, of course, on the last day, they cannot have any stories about the election itself. So all you're seeing on TV is, and today Nigel Farage voted, and today David Cameron voted. that is the news coverage for the day. So
is Sunday generally a day off in France, not a work day?
Yeah, that's correct. So big Catholic country. Most folks would either be at home resting, relaxing. They're certainly not going to be working. It's certainly a big day off.
The United States elections are held on a Tuesday, and it's not a national holiday.
Big work day. And
there's no requirement for employers to like give you time to go off and vote.
Sure.
Which is ridiculous. Yep. And so you look at things like this, and you know the responsiveness of the Constitution, the higher proportion of representation, the sort of bending over backwards to accommodate voters. It's like, come on, why can't we have that? Come on.
It's a nice system. I'm quite a fan of the French system.
That's it. I promise I'm done with my rant. So let's get back to France. In this upcoming election, there are 11 candidates in this first run, and I cannot pronounce the names of the people with less than 5% that are polling at less than 5%. So, Adam, could you give us just a brief overview of these other 6 candidates other than the top 5? Because we more or less know they have no chance of getting to the second round.
Yeah, we're essentially only going to be focusing on the top 5, which actually just a few weeks ago was going to be 4 when we were kind of first thinking of putting this thing together. There was only 4 major candidates, but one of them has kind of made essentially become a rising star. So nonetheless, there are now 6 other candidates that are polling below 5%. So here they are, and we're just going to include a couple of their interesting details here. So the first is Nathalie Arthaud. She's from a campaign called The Workers' Struggle. She is a literal Trotskyist. Now, sometimes I hyperbolically use the term Trotskyist for Corbyn, but Natalie actually is a Trotskyist. So she wants to prohibit redundancies and job cuts. She wants to increase salaries and pensions to 1,800 euros, and she wants to impose worker control on enterprises and the ownership of the means of production. So it is
pure
it's going right back to Marxism and Trotskyism. It's just pure left wing. Next, you've got François Asselineau from the Popular Republic Union. Now, he is a nationalist, but also an anti-American. He wants the withdrawal of France from the EU, from the Eurozone, the currency, and from NATO. He also wants to re-nationalise big industries and private corporations. Then you've got Jacques Cheminade, who's essentially an independent, and he just wants to ditch the EU and abandon the euro as well. Next, you've got Nicolas Dupont-Aignan from Stand Up France. Now, Nicolas is a Gaullist, which essentially means that he is the ideological continuation of the philosophy of Charles de Gaulle, which means he is a big supporter of French sovereignty. So essentially the idea that France should be able to exist on its own without even the aid of allies. So he wants to leave the euro. He wants to scrap the EU entirely. But he also does call for higher ethical standards for elected officials. And he wants to put jihadism and the fight against jihadism at the centre of foreign policy. Next, you've got Jean Lassalle, who is essentially a centrist activist, if such a thing can exist. He's just an independent MP who wants to renegotiate European treaties. And then finally, you've got Philippe Poutou, from the New Anti-Capitalist Party. Essentially, he wants to lower the retirement age to 60, and he wants to reduce the working week to 32 hours. But he also wants to make abortion and contraception free and accessible for everyone. So those are the 6 candidates that are currently polling below 5%, essentially have not a chance of getting through to the second round. They are literally fringe, and if not kind of essentially irrelevant. They're essentially one issue or, a couple interrelated issue parties, candidates. Who essentially have no chance of actually making it into the second round.
Any of those parties do you think will be needed for coalition?
Well, because these are such fringe candidates, they don't really represent parties that have any legislative power either. So I doubt that you'll actually see any of them, or any of the parties that they represent actually winning seats in the National Assembly anyway. So no, they are that fringe that they won't even factor later on.
So those are all the let's say, unimportant candidates who are essentially polling at less than 5%, no chance of winning or really influencing the government. But there are 5 candidates that essentially, well, Amon probably doesn't have much of a chance to get into the runoff, but there are 5 candidates polling really above 5%, and 4 of those essentially have a chance at getting into the second round runoff. They have at least a fighting chance to get into the second round runoff. So let's dive into a little bit more detail in those. The first one that we're going to look at is Marine Le Pen. What about her?
So we'll do this essentially on descending order as they currently stand in the polls. So Marine Le Pen is topping the polls at the moment at about 25%. She's the leader of the Front National, the National Front, and has been since 2011. Now, the Front National before her time was kind of an obviously xenophobic and anti-Semitic party with a real bent towards authoritarianism. But since her leadership, she's modernized the party, she's softened the xenophobic tone of the party, and essentially she's just turned it into a pragmatic nationalist populist party. So essentially whatever is happening on the stage of the national events of the day, she will take up essentially a pro-French culture stance, whatever that is. So she is essentially the ideological counterpart to Trump and to Putin, and arguably the Front National is also part of that conservative philosophical alignment that I've been chatting about as well over the past couple episodes, although their main concern is for French tradition and culture. They want to protect it, and so they would advocate for French sovereignty over currency and borders, like Geert Wilders in the Netherlands. They're an anti-Islam party. In fact, I think Marine Le Pen once compared Muslims praying in the street to the German occupation. So that didn't seem to go down well, but the tone has softened a bit. A few of the policies that Marine Le Pen has been standing on, she is advocating for the automatic expulsion of illegal immigrants and the limitation of legal immigrants to 10,000 per year. She wants to close extremist mosques. She wants to prioritise French citizens and social housing. She wants to fix the retirement age at 60 and to fix the working week at 35. She also wants France to drop the euro and renegotiate the structure of the EU, but she doesn't want to leave the EU. Many people assume that she's anti-EU enough to pull France out of the EU. She just wants to renegotiate. Now, obviously, she's not for further integration, so she'd rather see France take back more sovereignty, although, again, without leaving that the single market in particular.
So just behind Marine Le Pen in the polls is Emmanuel Macron, who is an independent from the party En Marche, which basically means on the march. Correct me if I'm wrong, Adam. This party was really only recently founded?
Well, it's technically debatable as to whether it's a party. It's, I think, more of a political movement, but it might field candidates elsewhere, so the border's a little bit hazy.
He's 39 years old, and essentially he would be the youngest French president ever. He's a political outsider. He's never been elected to public office, but he did serve as financial advisor and then Minister of Economy under the current president, Francois Hollande. Essentially, he is the head of a centrist political movement that defines itself by being neither left nor right. He's really the most explicitly pro-EU candidate. And a few of his policies. He wants to modernize the French economy, whatever that means. He wants 50 billion euro in public investments such as job training. He wants to exit from fossil fuel industries like coal for renewable energy. And he wants to spend on infrastructure. He wants glasses, dentures, and hearing aids to be covered by the government. He wants a big cut in corporate taxes and leeway for companies to renegotiate the 35-hour work week. He aims to cut the employment rate from 9.7%, which is the current rate, to 7%. And he wants to ban mobile phone use in schools for kids under the age of 15. And he wants to give a 500 euro culture pass to kids when they turn 18, which is essentially he just wants them to go out and spend that to go to a museum or invest in culture. Macron has support from across the political spectrum, which is interesting. There have been some high-profile names that have defected from their own parties to actually support Macron. Francois Bayrou, a centrist who forwent his own candidacy, he decided not to run to support Macron. And he did that because of fears that if he were to split the centrist vote too much, that could result in Marine Le Pen actually winning the presidency. Now, he is a centrist. He's more philosophically aligned with Macron. But what was really fascinating is a fellow by the name of Manuel Valls, who is the former prime minister under the current Hollande government. He's a socialist. He's in part of the Socialist Party. He came out in support of Macron. And this has been sort of seen as a traitorous move because he said that he would support Benoît Hamon, which is the Socialist Party's Socialist Party's candidate. But he came out to support Macron because he really essentially sees him as the only candidate that would beat Le Pen in a runoff, which it seems likely that will be the scenario. It will be a runoff between Macron and Le Pen. And because we tend to romanticize French love lives, fun fact, he's married to his former teacher, who is 24 years older than him. And he, as a 39-year-old, he has 7 step-grandchildren.
He could end up being the youngest president in French history, and he still has 7 step-grandchildren. The bounds of love don't exist, so...
They're certainly blurred.
Happily married. I mean, each to their own. If the final contenders aren't Marine Le Pen and Emmanuel Macron, then chances are it's going to be Marine Le Pen and this guy, Francois Fillon. Well, actually, it used to be before he got embroiled in scandal. But anyway, he is the candidate for Les Républicains, the Republicans, the centre-right conservatives. His campaign was essentially torpedoed by allegations that he was paying his wife using public funds for a position in his employ that actually came with little or no work at all. And also, allegedly, it seems like 2 of his children have also benefited from such arrangements, with public money finding its way into their pockets.
Classic political nepotism corruption that you see all the time, but I think he's gotten himself into more trouble by not being open about it and just lying his way through it, essentially. At first, when the allegations were brought up about his children, he said that they were being paid for their skills as lawyers, but when you actually dug into it, they were only in law school at the time. They weren't lawyers, so he shouldn't have been paying them as lawyers, but he's definitely not helped himself at all.
No, and France is not immune, and I say that with a heavy dose of understatement, from corruption in politics. It has a serious problem. And especially in an era when people are literally thinking, right, we need to ditch the establishment for the anti-establishment. He just came up as the establishment guy with a corruption scandal, and it absolutely torpedoed his candidacy, so much so that he's now running about 19% in the polls.
And he also did not help himself, because when this first started coming out and the story was first released in the news, he essentially said, if I get placed under formal investigation, I will not run as the candidate, and then essentially cede his candidacy to Alain Juppé, who was the runner-up in the primary. He hasn't done that. He was placed under investigation like 2 weeks ago, and he still has not resigned his candidacy.
And he suddenly decided not to resign. That doesn't make a lot of sense, especially with the way that the polls are moving. Maybe something happens in the next couple of weeks, but I don't see François Fillon being able to revitalise his candidacy in any way. Anyway, for what it is worth, his policies, it really is a typical conservative. So he wants to scrap 500,000 jobs from the public sector, and he wants to remove and increase the 35-hour work week. He wants to remove a wealth tax. He wants to strip jihadis of French nationality. He also wants to require parents who are in acceptance of social welfare to agree to something called the parental responsibility contract. Essentially, this is a contract, an agreement made between the state and the parents to reduce absenteeism in students. It's an antisocial behaviour contract, and it's also to reduce behaviour, and this is quote from the Fillon campaign itself, disrespectful to the values of the Republic, which I thought was very interesting. So it's almost a little thing in there to make sure that parents who are on social welfare make sure that their kids don't become little revolutionaries against the state.
God forbid.
Oh, God forbid. Interestingly, he would also support lifting sanctions on Russia, and he would also help Assad in Syria to defeat ISIS. Now, we couldn't find if there was a change in policy in recent days given what's recently happened in Syria, so I think that this policy still stands.
Next, we have Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who was a part of the Socialist Party until last year. Literally, we mentioned this earlier, split off and started his own party called Unsubmissive France. Now, he wasn't even anywhere close to potentially going into the second round, but recently, he has jumped in the polls. He's almost at 18% now. And this rise sort of comes on the back of a really impressive performance at the second presidential debate. He's currently a minister of the European Parliament, which is interesting because he is a lefty who is Eurosceptic. He doesn't want to be in the EU. He wants to at least reform it. If not, he advocates for Frexit, which is the France exiting the EU.
May that term burn in hell.
Yeah. Some of his policies, he advocates the Sixth Republic, which essentially would be a new constitution and a completely new structure of the government. He wants to lower the voting age to 16. He actually wants to strengthen the legislative assembly with a constituent assembly voted in by proportional representation. He wants to get to zero homelessness, which is admirable. He wants prescribed health care covered by the state. And he wants to actually recognize burnout, as in becoming burnt out from your career, to be recognized as an occupational disease, which is pretty interesting. I qualify for that.
Yeah, I mean, the guy is literally backed by the Communist Party in the presidential election this time around. So he is, again, another proper lefty. But I couldn't find it anywhere in my research, but I kept seeing people allude to the fact that he has, as part of his campaign, he has a Bleed the Rich video game. Do you know anything about that? Yeah, so someone created this game with him as a character, and it's essentially Mélenchon running through a little virtual universe killing rich people. So that does exist. He was also, interestingly, to begin his presidential campaign, he was beamed into an arena with hundreds of fans via hologram.
Yeah,
so he gave his first speech by hologram, which was quite cool. So, but I'm not sure how much these little stunts are necessarily paying off. But really, the thing that ultimately kick-started his upswing in support was his performance during the second presidential debate, as you mentioned.
Just looking at his policies for our American listeners, when the media tries to tell you that Bernie Sanders is a radical leftist, he's not. Okay, this guy is a radical leftist, and he is actually positioned to potentially be in the second round runoff of the French presidential election.
He's in for a fighting chance. He's challenging Fillon for that third spot. If he can knock his points up, perhaps a few more, he could even be challenging Macron or Le Pen as well for that second spot. So, France is historically a left-leaning country. It is a country of social welfare. It has had a strong left-wing streak. Even if they haven't always been in power, there is always, you see strikes often in France. That's often kind of an image of France that we get on television. There's a reason why workers' rights are so strong, is because of the huge left-wing streak that exists in the French political psyche.
Yeah, and then completely different than the United States, you have a much wider political spectrum in the country.
Of course. Yeah, definitely.
In the U.S., it's so narrow that Hillary Clinton is considered this wackadoo liberal.
Well, and considering that the French literally have a communist party that, perhaps the communists themselves don't do well, but they have a variety of left-leaning parties that do well. In fact, I think could even be gaining, I think it was about 10% of the vote. In some of the most recent polls for the Legislative Assembly, for instance. So that is yet to be seen. That'll be seen in a month. But yeah, it's certainly there. Wide spectrum. From Marine Le Pen out on the far right to the Communist Party out on the far left. It really is all there, and it's all represented somewhere. And that's kind of some of the beauties of the French system there. Finally, we have this poor sap, Benoit Hamon. Now, you mentioned Bernie Sanders there. Benoit Hamon is known as the French Bernie Sanders. Unfortunately, he's not going to experience anything in terms of Bernie's support. It's sad is the only word I can think of. The socialists have gone from being the ruling power, François Hollande, the current president, being a socialist himself, to essentially only having the support of about 9% of the population. So similar as to what we've seen in countries in the past, that is the centre-left dying, completely dying out. So this poor guy has been given the mantle with which he will fail miserably. So,
just to give you some perspective as to how unpopular the socialists are right now in France, François Hollande, who is the current president, is of the Socialist Party. He is so unpopular. He has chosen not to run for a second term. This is the first time since the Fifth Republic was formed in 1958 that the incumbent president has not run for a second term. That's how unpopular he is, because he knows he would fail.
It was very obvious from very, very early on that François Hollande would not be running for a second term. The poor guy ran into a few major issues. One, he came to power at the time of quite a high austerity on a ticket of anti-austerity. And then as soon as he got into office, he realised, we really can't afford not to forego austerity. And so he kept, as a socialist, a budget platform that couldn't be differentiated from the right. He also instituted a new rule in 2016 that allowed companies to hire and fire a little bit more easily. Now, perhaps France needs some relaxation of its hiring and firing laws, but for it to come from a socialist president, it didn't feel right. And not to mention that the poor guy suffers from a lot of personal stuff as well. His speech, his demeanour, his character is just not presidential, and so the poor guy has suffered for it. And actually, his predecessor here, Benoit Hamon, is an entertaining guy, and he is legitimately presidential, and could easily carry himself well in office. But the mark of the socialist is there. It's just not going to win. Is bad PR.
As we've seen in many countries, as we've seen in the United States, you get people like Obama who are elected on these dreams of great things to happen. And then he more or less governs as a centrist, if not even a right-leaning centrist. We didn't stop our interventions. We did hardly anything to help. Well, he did Obamacare, but that's hardly indistinguishable from a right-wing proposition. It's not a real liberal thing that he did. So you're looking at the Democrats that we have now, and when the establishment gets to the point where it's hard to distinguish the left from the right, it's not hard to see why these fringe, not even fringe, but these outsider parties like En Marche, like the National Front, they're doing well because people just hate the establishment.
They've grown to seriously distrust the establishment. And the establishment this time round are the socialist and the Republicans as well. So, unfortunately, you've got poor Benoit Hamon, who is reaping the consequences of that. So, even though we don't expect him to do well at all, he is currently sitting about 9% in the polls. Here are some of his policies nonetheless. He does want to legalize cannabis. So he really would be in the position for a Bernie Sanders mantle. He wants to scrap that 2016 law making it easier to hire and fire workers like a true socialist might want to. He wants a basic income, so he's thinking €600 a month for the unemployed and €200 a month for those on minimum wage. He wants to see renewable energy cover 50% of electricity use by 2025, and he wants to cut out completely nuclear energy by 2050. And he also wants, and I thought this was a cracking good policy, or at least an interesting one, and it's probably worth testing. He wants to tax wealth created by robots. Isn't that an interesting policy? That's
an excellent idea, because you're going to... This is getting a little afield from the French election, but what we're going to see in the next 20, 30, 50 years is a move away from people working and robots working. And at that time, you're going to have a lot of problems because people are going to start losing jobs and things like that. Coupling a tax on the wealth produced by robots and introducing a guaranteed minimum income, I think that's where you have to go in the future to avoid out and out just proletariat revolution, torches and pitchforks, because the wealth inequality is already at such a high level. It's at levels that we haven't seen since before the French Revolution, ironically. You have to take steps to prepare for that, or it's going to bite us in the ass.
And isn't it interesting that, such a creative and possibly worthwhile experiment is coming from a party that are just going to be completely dismantled in the upcoming election. So I think these are good ideas that we might need to try at some point in the future, but it's not going to happen here at this presidential election anyway. But I thought it was just spectacular. Tax wealth created by robots.
So now we know the candidates, even the ones that aren't polling very highly. What are the possible outcomes of the election? Essentially, we know it's going to go to a second round runoff. It's never happened that in the first round somebody's reached 50%, at least in the Fifth Republic. So we know that it's going to be a runoff. We just aren't 100% sure who the runoff is going to be between.
So yeah, when we're talking about predictions, when we're talking about pollings, we need to essentially be aware of a couple of things. One, as you mentioned, there's the two-round nature of the French presidential election, but then polling itself then takes on two forms. It's an analysis of the whole field on one part, and then it's head-to-head analyses as well. So as we said, Marine Le Pen is leading with around 25% of the vote. And if this was an election in which the simple plurality was the winner, she could conceivably be the president. So fortunately, there is that second round. Now, Macron is sitting at about 23%, with Fillon sitting about 19%, Mélenchon being the closest challenger to him, shooting from 11 to 12% up to 19%, and then of course you've got poor Benoit Hamon sitting back about 9%. So that's kind of the analysis of the larger field, obviously with the other six being below 5%. When it comes to head-to-head, there's only a couple races that have really been analysed closely. One is obviously the Le Pen-Macron head-to-head. And in that circumstance, Marine Le Pen doesn't make up a lot of support beyond her 25% base once she gets to the second round. She's only polling at around 37% against Macron, whereas Macron is polling around 63%. So this is why we're so confident that Marine Le Pen won't be the president, so that while she is the frontrunner in the polls at the moment, because of the two-tiered nature of the election, there's no chance that she'll win the second round. So, John, as you were saying right at the beginning of the podcast, the Front National have been in the presidential second round before, and they were completely torn apart because everyone else decided that no, we are not right-wingers at all. We want the other guy. And I do think that the same would largely be true here.
Essentially what you're going to see is the center-right and even center-left ideological alignment that in 2002 caused Jean-Marie Le Pen to lose in the second election, because people are essentially going to say, no, yeah, you got this far, but we're not going to have it.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, while the Front National has kind of softened its stances on a lot of perhaps more xenophobic policy stances, they're still very much seen as an uncouth political party. And so while you certainly won't see the same kind of blowing out of the water, like she could still get around 35, 37, 40% of the vote, it's very much in doubt that she can win it.
So the official commoner's prediction then would be in the first round, Macron and Le Pen, top two, and then in the runoff it would be Macron, who's center-left, sort of, would you be comfortable calling him sort of the business-as-usual candidate?
No, I wouldn't call him the business as usual. He probably represents a lot of the same policy positions that you would find from kind of the business as usual parties, but he is distinctly anti-establishment. So his entire policy structure is one that just isn't distinctly left or right. Like, so he is for the worker and yet for corporation tax cuts. So like, it's essentially a return to or an establishment of the common sense middle ground, which seems to have been slowly fading out to the extremes on both sides.
Yeah, so I guess thinking about that, I'd like to dig deeper a little bit into what's going on. So what we're seeing is there's a fractured left, obviously. So you have Benoît Hamon and you have Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who essentially they sort of are trying to appeal to the same base of voters, because they're both socialists, they're both leftists, they're both tax and spend, but they are distinctly different in their attitudes towards the EU and other things. So Hamon is for more integration, whereas Mélenchon is skeptic at best, Frexit at worst, right?
Yep.
But these two, while they do appeal to the same sort of base of voters, they have not reconciled and come together and said, let's join forces to try to win and gain a government. And also, Hamon is plagued by his association with the socialists because of François Hollande. And
Benoît Hamon is actually from the far left of the Socialist Party. So you're right, he does have a lot in common with Mélenchon. The problem is that I would even say that Hamon is more of a progressive leftist, whereas I don't see Mélenchon as a liberal at all. In fact, I think Mélenchon is on record as saying that he couldn't stand the liberal leanings of the Socialist Party. And now that's liberal as in the sovereignty, the importance of the individual. He's very much a communitarian. It really is almost a communist out there. So while in policy they might look the same, I think there are just specific philosophical differences that divide them. Mélenchon, of course, being more of the old guard, proper Marxist essentially, yeah. Benoît Hamon being more of a kind of what we would conceive of a progressive liberal.
So you have that split. And there's not really a unified front on the far left, right?
Correct. That's right.
The center right, under the Republicans and Fillon, is completely undermined because he is embroiled in scandal. He continues to trip over his own feet, put his feet in his mouth, and he just can't seem to pull himself out of this, and it just is getting worse for him. Almost guaranteed he's not going to win enough. He's actually fallen behind Mélenchon now in the polls.
All right.
Yeah. So now Mélenchon is essentially the third option. Which people are pointing out. The thing is, Mélenchon technically is in the range of possible error in the polling. And international markets are taking notice to his jump in the polls, and they're actually getting a little skittish about investing in French debt and things like that because this dude is so far to the extreme, and he wants to get out of the EU, and he's supremely nationalist and all that kind of stuff. So it's getting interesting.
Sure. Doesn't it say something, especially on the anti-establishment front, that your two main establishment parties are fourth and fifth in the polls?
Oh yeah,
fourth and fifth, like a combined less than 30%.
Right, and this is where what I wanted to get into, where I can see almost maybe Macron's dedication to being in the center and being neither left nor right can maybe come back and hurt him. So you have the left fractured, except for Mélenchon, who seems to be gaining, but not likely, at least now, that he would get into the runoff. You have Fillon, who obviously is having his issues. What's left is Marine Le Pen and Emmanuel Macron. So Macron's initially his claim to fame, or what made him attractive, was that he wasn't establishment, that he was coming from the outside. He started his own movement, not even really necessarily a political party, but he came in from the outside. He never held political office. He had always all these great ideas, but he was distinctly not the establishment. You have Marine Le Pen, who's obviously not the establishment. She is far and away outside of the establishment. She's not mainstream at all. But what we were talking about earlier with the defections that have been happening in support of Macron, who essentially are doing this because they don't want Marine Le Pen elected. I'm wondering, especially in your opinion, because you probably deal with this more than I do, with the establishment coming behind Macron, do you think that he'll start to shift in the view of the people as less of an outsider and more of business as usual? And that's why I asked that question earlier. I just want to read a couple quotes to you. So this is coming from François Fillon, and obviously he has a vested interest in undermining Macron, but what he said after Manuel Valls, who was the socialist prime minister under Hollande, who defected and started to support Macron out of fear of Le Pen, what Le Fillon said specifically about Macron after that was, quote, "With Valls' endorsement, it is now clear that the Hollande government is going into extra time. Need a change of power. Hollande's whole team is surrounding Macron. It's what I've always said, Emmanuel Macron is François Hollande." That's one. Le Pen, in response to the same defection of Valls supporting Macron, quote, "This confirms that Emmanuel Macron has become a mere cog in the grand plan to rescue Hollande land. His candidacy is manifestly under the tutelage of the outgoing government, under the tutelage of a system that wants to find new jobs for itself at all costs. We knew Macron's bid was empty. Now we know that it is nothing but a veneer for the system." So what I'm wondering, I guess, is with the establishment, Hollande, and Hollande has said that his prime objective or his prime duty is to make sure that Le Pen does not get elected, so he would be supporting somebody like Macron, especially in the second round. Does the endorsement of the establishment actually hurt Macron's chances in a second round runoff against Le Pen, because people hate Hollande? Like, they don't want the socialists back in power. They don't want anything close or similar to what's been happening over the last 5 years.
My feeling is, no, it won't hurt him in the long run. Because I think what the French have experienced over the past 5 years, particularly under Hollande, is a real dose of realism, in a sense, in which the guy that actually comes up to them and says, look, we really need to modernise the French economy or it's not going to keep working. We really can't continue spending X amount on the state. We need to cut something here. But you know what? This actually needs investment. Essentially, someone who is straight talking, who hasn't been part of the system, just is more trustworthy. And because, perhaps in particular, because it's coming from folks like Le Pen and Fillon, I'm not sure if it'll be taken without a grain of salt. So I think naturally, Macron will fit well with the socialists. He'll fit with the centre-left more than he will with the centre-right. But a few of his policies are actually in contradiction to the socialist policy. Particularly for instance, the cut on corporation tax. So I think most will simply appreciate the fact that someone is coming to them with some semblance of reality and say, no, this is not shiny, but this is what we're going to do about it. And so I think that will gain him the support that he'll need to take both rounds.
Essentially, I guess what you're saying then is it's how he's framing his campaign then. It's not as if what Hollande was coming into office saying he was going to do these grandiose things.
Correct.
Or seeking to do these grandiose things and then disappointing people. He's sort of looking at the political realism aspect of being a president and being a head of state and having to deal with all of the competing interests within the government. Essentially, he's looking at it head on and saying, yeah, well, this is what we're going to do. We're going to try to govern from the center. I'm not trying to promise you anything else.
Yeah. almost as a neutral party, which is kind of odd. That's the way I see it, is that by the time you get through the legislative assemblies in June, if you have a socialist majority in there, guess what? Your prime minister's going to be socialist, and Macron, the socialist, will be able to work well with each other. If it happens to be a right-wing majority, then guess what? It's going to be a centre-right party, and Macron's still going to be able to work with them because there's going to be mutual agreement. In fact, I would almost argue for, if not expect, a grand coalition within the General Assembly in which you have the two big parties on the centre-left and centre-right working together to form the government. I would love to see that. I think that would be appreciated by many, but I'm not going to predict it. That is what I would like to see.
So do you think that then Macron maybe is viewed so similarly? Obviously, he doesn't have necessarily the same policy positions, but similarly to somebody like Theresa May, who would be a safe pair of hands in an uncertain time, or like what we were talking about in the Netherlands with, is it Rutte?
Yeah, that's right.
He's seen sort of as a safe pair of hands in the face of somebody like Geert Wilders. You see sort of the center left, center right, centrist conglomeration of whatever Macron believes to be sort of the safe pair of hands to put France in, at least for the next 5 years.
I'm not sure if it's considered a safe pair of hands. Actually, I think it's quite a big risk for the French to appoint Macron as president. I think what he represents is a breath of fresh air. It's like, we need change, we want change, and this is the only guy who we think can offer that change. Now, Marine Le Pen is also offering change, but it's not a change that most people will want to see. At least Macron is a fresh-faced. Again, he doesn't have his hands dirty at all. He was the Minister of Minister of the Economy for just a few years under Hollande, but other than that, he's a fairly fresh-faced. In fact, he is responsible for something called the Macron Law, which was a really, almost, I think, quite successful, quite well-regarded economic modernization plan. And so I think he already has positive things working for him, so much so that, maybe you're right. Maybe he is also that safer pair of hands as well. Because I think, I almost envisage him coming in as a referee with power to kind of stop the game, to remake the rules, and to continue on a fairer playing field. How's that for a metaphor?
So I guess I can't help but draw comparisons to the U.S. So we all thought the same sort of thing about Hillary Clinton. People sort of, she wasn't really offering change. Maybe she tweak a few things here and there. She was definitely going to govern from the American center, which is definitely not the international center, but she was going to govern from the center. And we saw her beat by Trump, who did offer some sort of palpable change. What I'm seeing is that Macron isn't going to really offer a huge amount of change, but Le Pen would. Do you think that there's any attraction there? And something also that I saw, 30% of voters are still undecided. A full third of voters are undecided, which is incredible. I was looking at historical data, and I think the most up until now that were undecided this close to the election was like 20%. So you have literally a third of the population that are likely voters saying, I don't know. A lot of these people won't even know until they go into the voting booth. And that, to me, is a dangerous situation, because if you aren't decided before you go in, think about Brexit. People who were undecided about that, you go in and say, yeah, okay, I'll pull the lever for this because it's not going to happen. But, I'd rather have her than whatever. Do you think that has any bearing, or do you think that could be a contributing factor into this? Is essentially what I'm saying is there a dark horse element to Le Pen that maybe we're not seeing because we don't want to see it?
I don't think Le Pen is too much of a dark horse. I think she's very well known. She's run in presidential elections in the past herself. She ended up third in the last one, for instance. As you said, her dad ended up getting through the second round in 2002. So that we do have a history. We know how the National Front has performed historically. On the other hand, she fits well into the rise of the right wing that is seemingly spreading across Europe. But at the same time, as we saw in the Netherlands, as we're kind of seeing in Germany already regarding polling data, for instance, and state elections, the far right rise is being met with a counter force as well, that is seeing in both Germany and in the Netherlands the main ruling party kind of cemented further in power. So that won't happen this time because, the ruling power is socialist, but, perhaps the next best thing is someone like Macron, who is actually not too far from the socialists, having already served in one of the ministries.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going through this line of questioning because obviously I'm not plugged into French culture. So the prime minister that I mentioned, the defector Manuel Valls, essentially he had this, I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but he did say that he is positive that the support for Le Pen is much more farther reaching than the polling data suggests. I don't know if there's any legitimacy to that, but we did see similar things happening in the United States. It's just, I guess I kind of get uncomfortable when we go into a situation where we're saying there's a high degree of certainty that X candidate's going to win. I mean, that just seems ripe for something terrible to happen, like Le Pen get elected. Or, I don't know, President Trump.
I'm still not personally convinced that enough people would be willing to take the chance on a far-right group, especially one that advocates for again, and this was kind of my thing with Geert Wilders, is that while the sentiments of the right wing might actually be okay, so we talked about, for instance, Le Pen's stance on shutting down extremist mosques, perhaps not a bad policy. That might not be, shutting down terrorist cells, not a bad policy. Like, there's certainly policy bases on which everyone can agree with, but I think there's also this problem of dignity, and I think what the far right represents is essentially a philosophy that removes dignity from people by subjecting them to essentially second-class status, unwanted status, and I don't think that is yet a desire for any majority yet. That being said, though, we are talking about a increasingly pragmatic and populist Front National rather than xenophobic. So they are softening. Essentially, the closer these populist parties get to power, the more in line and less fringe-like they look. And then you've also got the under 30s that also tend to be quite nationalistic in France. So I've got a little quote here from a BBC article I came across, kind of looking at the youth in the alt-right movement in France. So this is how it reads. Following a group of activists handing out flyers in Paris, however, it is clear that they relish verbal confrontation. Their leader, Pierre Larty, who is 26, stands surrounded by a group of North African men handing out these flyers. One of them says to him, "When I read this leaflet, I understand that you don't want me here." And this is how he replies. "What we don't want is the replacement of our values by Islamic ones. France is historically a Christian country. I'm not criticizing anyone. What happens in your land is your business. What happens here is ours. We are against colonization, and this is why we don't want the same phenomenon to happen in reverse." Now, if you take that at face value, that's actually not bad, and it's kind of something that we've almost advocated ourselves regarding progressive values here. Certainly one
Guilty.
I've argued, and that there are perhaps circumstances in which there needs to be action taken to protect your foundational values. But at the same time, the Front National and the right wing don't give dignity to people.
Do you think people are willing to sacrifice dignity for at least some sort of action? Because it seems like the left just decides to ignore the problem entirely. So, just hear me out. We understand, obviously, as rational thinking people who aren't affected by these things, or as of yet affected by these things, that terrorist attacks are rare.
Yes.
Right? They don't happen all the time.
Terrorist attacks.
Statistically, they're rare. There has been an uptick recently over the last couple of years, and even in the last couple of weeks, of terrorist attacks in mainland Europe. Do you think that, I don't know, there's some sort of zeitgeist that is afraid of this, and they do see that, similar to, what Geert Wilders was talking about in the Netherlands, and you hear talk about this in the United States, obviously, the left just doesn't offer a palpable solution. The right, they're taking away dignity, but at least they're trying to offer a solution. Like, outlawing radical mosques, things like that. Like, there is the potential there, obviously, if you're shutting down mosques. If not everybody there is a radical or whatever, that you are sacrificing dignity, but it is probably, pragmatically, an intelligent policy to take. Right? Do you think am I misreading the situation at all, or do you think that there might be some sort of validity to that?
I think the larger problem is that the far right is essentially working on a basis of fear, and fear exaggerates statistics. So yes, there is a zeitgeist that, we're under attack from Islamic extremism, but statistically, it's very unlikely that you're going to, in fact, you're more likely going to be killed in a car accident than you're going to be killed by Islamic extremism. The problem is that our policies don't operate on functionally rational bases. They operate based on our perception of reality, which is often flawed and exaggerated.
True. To be a devil's advocate just a little bit, at least in a car accident, you are halfway in control of that situation. Terrorism, if a bomb goes off, if you're walking down the street, there's no control, it's random, it's just completely senseless, I guess is the idea. When you get into a car, you understand inherently you have a risk. You don't expect to inherently be at a risk, or you wouldn't want to be inherently at a risk of a terrorist attack just walking down the street.
I somewhat disagree. I think there is a perfectly reasonable, if not incredibly small expectation that, you're in a public place, and therefore, if it's not a bomb going off, for instance, then it's a piano dropping on your head, or a driver flying out of a road as you're crossing it at a green light. There's this, but see, that's the thing, is that these are things that we have come to expect. We know the risks of going outside. We know, we're not going to become shut-ins based on statistical evidence, but then, you've got this zeitgeist in the community that is driven by fear of these specific people, and so then even the innocents within those communities become the targets of our fear.
True. I guess to me that just rings too closely to, I think it was a couple of years, Sadiq Khan said something basically saying that, well, if you live in a large city, terrorism is just something that you're going to basically have to deal with. Right? Because you do live in a large population hub, and that just sort of rings too closely to that. It's like, it's just an acceptance of it as a fact. Whereas it's not a necessity. It's not a necessity.
No, I mean, there's an acceptance of it in the same way that, anything else can happen to you that can snuff out this little thing we call life. It's just a part of our existence. I don't necessarily in other words, I'm not going to change my actions because of it. And the problem is that fear is being used to manipulate our perception of it. Now, I recognize, for instance, that you cannot legislate against falling pianos, whereas you might be able to legislate, the control on your borders, for instance. But again, statistically, it just doesn't make sense. It doesn't work. And if you look at the particular terrorist attacks over the past few years, barring the couple that have happened over the past weeks, they've all been locally born, if not simply European born. So, for instance, the Paris attacks were by French and Belgians. The Westminster attack a few weeks ago was by someone from Kent. It's just statistically, it does not make sense. I think what the left fails to do is to come up with a strategy and a policy on the basis of hope. That there's no positive messaging that breaks through fear, or at least none that we've really found. Now, the only one I can think of is the Scottish independence referendum 2014. The Yes campaign was very much a positive campaign. And it still didn't work. It still didn't break through the anxieties about independence, the economic worries about independence. And so it's very difficult to create a hope-filled campaign.
Those people probably weren't radicalized by a non-Muslim individual in Kent. Essentially, I guess what I'm saying is, yeah, maybe that person is homeborn, but could there be an issue with higher, theoretically, higher levels of immigration causing communities that do foster these ideas, and then it just so happens that the radicalization happens to somebody who lives in the country, like we've seen in, I think it was Belgium and even France, where these communities, insular communities of radicalization, are yes, these people were citizens, but they were influenced by those.
Well, I guess you could get into a chicken and egg type scenario, though, a kind of chicken and egg argument. Well, what causes the insular communities? Is it the desire for these communities to live together, or is it the rejection of them from the larger community as a whole?
Well, I don't know. See, I don't know the answer to that. It either way, it stems from a failure of integration, but I mean, I guess you could look for policies that do push that. But does the left offer that as a solution?
Right. So therein lies my question is a strategy that is hope-filled, one that instead of focusing on shutting down borders, rather focuses on integration and actually giving people dignity and a desire to live in your country. There's too many circumstances in which immigrants coming to European countries are ignored and are sidelined by the larger community in general. And of course, naturally, they're going to communicate and congregate together in small communities and live out their own cultures together. They're not going to integrate into French, into Belgian communities. They're not going to integrate into British communities. These places just become easy targets for radicalization. So I don't think, on that basis then, that the Front National is the answer. Because all the Front National is going to do is close down borders, which, by the way, isn't going to stop radicalization anyway, because you don't need people in the same room to communicate an idea anymore.
Correct.
And the Front National is only going to sideline further these insular communities. They're not going to reintegrate into society or integrate at all into society. So they cannot be the answer to France's problem with radicalization, because there is no desire for the communities to talk to each other.
I agree with you that they shouldn't be the answer, and it's not the answer. However, it is an answer. So what does Macron offer on the other side?
Macron is an integrationist. He's an integrationist both at the European level and at the national level. And I think he would be a voice for reasoned dialogue with these insular communities. Whether that is possible within a short 5-year term, I don't know. I think it ultimately takes larger cultural change. And of course, when you're asking the French to change culturally, it's going to take a while. So the Front National cannot be the answer. I reject that further isolation of these communities is the answer or an answer. The problem is that fear speaks louder than any other emotion, especially in the political world, and that is what they run on.
And also, depending on how successful Macron is, he could run for a second term. So you're talking about 10 years rather than 5.
You could see 10 years, that's right.
And that actually, sort of as to wrap up the episode, essentially we're not going to know how powerful Macron essentially could be as president, or even Le Pen if she were to win, or Mélenchon on the outside chance. We're not really going to know what sort of how powerful they will be in creating policy until June, when we see the National Assembly elections.
That is correct, yeah. Ultimately, because it's a shared power, shared executive, the other half of the executive needs to be in place. So yeah, we won't really know until June time.
So you're still sticking with your prediction that it will be Macron?
Yeah, when you said it was a Commoners podcast official prediction that it's going to be Le Pen and Macron, that is, and then Macron win, that is shared by many other organizations. It's not just us. So, but it would be my prediction as well. I will be surprised if Mélenchon can make it into the second round. I'll be surprised if Fillon can make it into the second round. And I'll be very surprised if Le Pen wins. But stranger things, or at least things that are as strange as that, have happened.
Maybe then I'll go out on a limb and say my personal prediction, to be different, would be, let's say Mélenchon takes into the second round, and then he'll take it.
You think the semi-communist is going to win the presidency of France?
Why not? Maybe. We'll see. But So you think that Macron's going to win? What's your sense on how powerful he'll end up being as president? Do you think that the National Assembly will sort of veer in that direction?
I think that the difficulty for Macron is that because he will likely feel most home in the centre-left, he needs the socialists to do well in the National Assembly. And we're talking about the socialists, who have the worst PR problem of any political movement in France at the moment. So my guess is that you would likely have a centre-right majority. Now, whether that is the Republicans plus others, perhaps it's a right-wing coalition. Let's put it that way. And in that case, Macron will still be able to form a government. He'll still be able to pass many of the things that he wants, but I don't think he will be as powerful. Macron has the distinct advantage as a centrist, to say that no matter what comes out of the National Assembly, he will have a government that will work with him on at least half of his policy positions. So you won't find, for instance, a case of cohabitation, but that would be my expectation. The one thing that I would really like to see happen, like I said, is a grand coalition between centre-left and centre-right, with socialists and Republicans filling in different cabinet positions that really does become a multi-party government. I think that might be might be the best for France, and certainly an experiment in multi-party government might be good for Europe as well. So that would be my hope. Well, that is it. That is our French election special. Thank you for listening. We hope that you enjoyed it. Obviously, the campaigning still goes on. The first round will be on the 23rd, and the second round, the runoff, will be on May 7th. So we'll be keeping you up to date. You can follow us on Twitter at CommonersPod, where we will be keeping track ourselves of the campaign and the election results. We might also throw it into a Political Animals episode, and we might even do a live stream on the results a little bit later on as well. So keep up with us on Twitter for further details.
You can also subscribe to us on YouTube for any live streams, and we are posting our episodes out as videos just in case you want to listen there instead.
And speaking of live streams, on April 20th, we will be having a special live stream starting at 8 o'clock. It will be an informal discussion on morality. So John and I obviously have differences on religion, and so this is kind of almost a meta-level type conversation in which we discuss kind of the motivations behind why we have the political feelings we have. So we'll be discussing things like, is morality possible, period? Is morality possible without God? And how does morality factor into our political decision making? It should be a very interesting one. Again, April 20th, 8 p.m, and it'll also be posted as an episode on the 24th. Now, a little bit of a scheduling note, this will kind of replace a normal Commoners episode on the 24th, and the next Commoners episode after that will be on May 8th. So we'll kind of skip a little week, but with a little live stream slipped in the middle there. So don't forget to catch that.
Also, we are trying to improve Commoners Podcast. If you have any feedback or recommendations on topics, how we should approach the topics, if we suck, let us know. You can drop any sort of feedback at commonerspodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, stay informed.